There is a figure in a report from the National Institute on Retirement Security that demands a closer look. The median retirement savings for a typical Gen X household stands at just $40,000. Not $400,000, just $40,000. That represents the midpoint. Half of all households are actually below that mark. This statistic is not meant to terrify, but to dissect the reasons behind it. Once you comprehend the underlying mechanics, you might stop blaming yourself for the outcome. Here is the crucial twist. You weren't being careless. You were a test subject. Goldman Sachs has even labeled your generation. Chris Cedar, a senior strategist there, refers to Gen X as the 401k experiment generation. That is a documented quote from the very firm responsible for managing global wealth.
You were the first demographic in American history tasked with self-funding your own retirement via personal paychecks, using market accounts you selected yourself, without the safety net of a pension or a strategic roadmap. The generation preceding you enjoyed pensions and gold watches. The generation following you observed your struggle and understood the rules had changed. In 1994, you were handed a brochure and a contact for an HR representative, only to be labeled a slacker when you expressed skepticism. Let's examine the psychology of the fool, because that term carries a much deeper meaning than you might assume. The classical fool, the court jester or the tarot figure at the cliff's edge, is far from unintelligent.
The fool is the one who perceives the truth, yet enters the trap because it was the only path available. The fool is the intelligent skeptic who ended up paying the bill regardless. That is the version of you we are discussing. You aren't naive or lazy. You were cynical as a survival mechanism, often correct about the institutions you distrusted, yet somehow still facing a $400,000 retirement shortfall. Let me provide the specific data for that gap. Schroders conducted a 2025 U.S. retirement survey focusing on Gen Xers aged 45 to 60. They compared expected savings against actual needs. The resulting gap was $44,976, the most significant deficit of any generation surveyed.
This shortfall exceeds those of millennials and boomers, with only 16% of Gen Xers in that study feeling they have saved enough. Just 16%. You represent a generation that was measurably more skeptical of institutions than those before you. This very skepticism failed to protect you from the most critical institutional shift. Why? That is the dilemma of the fool. Cynicism serves as a shield against deception, but it offers no protection against the mathematics of compound interest. Looking broader, researcher Jean Twenge at San Diego State spent years analyzing generational trust. Her data shows that institutional trust in government, media, and corporations plummeted from roughly 33% among boomers to about 18% by the time Gen X matured.
This decline was a measurable collapse, not merely a shift in mood. Statistically, you were the most skeptical cohort in the room. A 2021 academic book by Melissa Vosen Collins explores this, linking Gen X's cynicism to the themes found in Stranger Things and 1980s cinema. She argues your defining trait is institutional distrust, paired with a stubborn drive to build private security within families and small circles. Don't trust the system. Build a smaller one you can control. While being skeptical and independent are generally positive traits, this is where the fool is caught. The one institution you couldn't bypass was the one that quietly transformed beneath you.
Pensions, where they existed, were a pact between your employer and your future. They didn't require your belief or your management. They functioned like a background utility. However, between the mid-'80s and the '90s, that utility was disconnected for most private sector workers and replaced by a self-service kiosk known as the 401k. The 401k was never intended to be a pension replacement. It began as a tax advantage for executives,
before being drafted into a much larger duty. No one explained the implications of this transition. You received an enrollment packet, chose between a few mutual funds with corporate-sounding names, and guessed at your contribution percentage.
If you were lucky, someone mentioned the company match. If not, you learned about it years later from a colleague. The Goldman Sachs description of an experience generation is accurate. You were the A/B test. No one knew the long-term impact because no one had lived through a full career under this model. They are discovering the results now by analyzing your bank accounts. An Allianz Life study from 2025 revealed that 81% of Gen Xers worry about affording retirement. That is higher than Gen Z, higher than millennials, and crucially, higher than boomers. The generation closest to retirement is more anxious than the one already in it.
This is the experiment's data manifesting. You might wonder, if the system was rigged, why didn't I figure it out? There are several reasons, none of which are character flaws. First, you were the pioneers. There were no older mentors to offer guidance. Your parents either had a pension or they didn't, but neither could coach you through a fidelity statement. You were learning to play the instrument while you were actively performing. Second, the skepticism that helped you socially hindered you financially. If you distrusted advisors, markets, or employers, you made rational choices in isolation.
However, when those instincts are stacked over 30 years, they result in a $40,000 median. Third, and this is a harder truth to acknowledge, you were absorbing immense life burdens. You were managing aging parents, funding college, maintaining homes, and navigating shifting careers. The capital that should have been compounding in index funds was instead used to repair roofs, pay for prescriptions, or support children through school. You weren't wasting money. You were investing it in people. Now, back to the fool.
There is one final layer to this setup that is currently destabilizing in real time: Social Security. Projections suggest the trust fund could be depleted by 2033. Without legislative intervention, the program might only cover 77% of scheduled benefits, a 23% reduction. This hits your cohort at the worst moment, as you are either retiring or in your final decade of saving. Visualize the cumulative impact. Pensions are gone, the 401k experiment is underperforming, and Social Security is facing a significant cut just as you reach the finish line. Economist Teresa Guillerducci, an expert in retirement policy, told CBS News that the DIY 401k model is flimsy.
That is a professional assessment of the very structure you were given. Almost half of Gen X in that same report stated that retiring will require a miracle. This is where the fool's psychology becomes specific. When a flimsy structure is presented as solid and then begins to fail, you have two choices. You can panic, or you can do what many of you have done for 30 years, quietly absorb the impact. You take the hit without making a scene, without asking for help, and without burdening your family. You simply try to figure out the next move. This instinct to absorb quietly kept families afloat, but it also allowed retirement problems to remain hidden for decades.
The same trait that makes you reliable makes you slow to seek assistance. The fool walks the cliff alone because asking for directions feels like admitting defeat. Consider the contrast. Boomers had pensions, housing stability, and full Social Security. Millennials benefit from auto-enrollment, target date funds, and a massive bull market. You were given a clipboard instead of guardrails. And as the data suggests, you were labeled by others as cynical or detached. Twenge's research confirms your institutional skepticism was a measurable reality, not a personality flaw. It was an accurate assessment of a changing landscape.
Here is a powerful data point from the International Council of Shopping Centers. Gen X makes up 19% of the U.S. population, but drives 31% of all spending. Per capita, you were one of the most economically potent generations. a group retailers cannot afford to ignore. So, look at the big picture. You are a top-spending cohort, yet the most worried about retirement, the least prepared by most metrics, and the most skeptical of the systems meant to support you. You are heading toward a Social Security reduction with a $40,000 median nest egg.
This is the portrait of the fool in the classical sense. Seeing the reality clearly, carrying the weight of others, and facing a shortfall in exactly what will be needed next. But here's the reframe. The fool in the tarot represents the beginning of a journey, not the end. The card is numbered 0 for a reason. The cliff is not a dead end. It is the moment before the leap. The broken systems behind you do not dictate the math of your future. Gen X is currently in its peak earning years. Goldman's research shows that while many are behind, a significant portion are actually on track. Those who succeeded use the same flimsy tools and the same conditions. This means there is still room to maneuver. 3 specific moves can alter your trajectory. First, use catch-up contributions. If you are over 50, the IRS allows extra contributions to your 401k and IRA.
Many overlook this because they assume they cannot afford it. But even partial use can significantly impact your final balance. Second, ensure you are maximizing the employer match. No other investment offers the immediate return of a full match. Third, engage in a conversation with a fiduciary advisor. The skepticism is valid, but fee-only fiduciaries, who are legally bound to your interest, are a different breed than the brokers of the past. The fool walks alone, but those who cross the cliff usually don't. The fool isn't a joke. The fool is the one who saw the truth and still has to do the work.
That is you. Your cynicism was justified, and the setup was indeed rigged. But the next move remains in your hands. You were the subject of the experiment, but the story isn't over. You now have the clarity to decide how to write the final chapters. One last thought. The fool's true strength is the pattern recognition you've developed. You have spent 30 years reading the fine print that others ignored. That skill is still vital. You just weren't told that the 401k statement was the document you needed to scrutinize.
Now that you know, do it. Review your statements, check your contribution rates, and verify your investments. Many are still sitting in low-yield funds chosen decades ago. Stop treating it as an unattended room. Walk in and take an unsentimental look at the numbers. Don't spiral into shame. Just identify the gap and the move. Apply the same pragmatic energy you use to fix a household crisis. The data points I mentioned are just snapshots, not inevitable forecasts. The median is just a middle, and there is a top half of people who are doing well. Those people aren't luckier. They simply stopped treating retirement as someone else's responsibility and started treating it as their own domain. This isn't a pep talk. It's a reality check. The room is yours. The experiment gave you the keys. Now walk in and take control.